We now move closer in time to relatives who feel only just out of reach, rather than situated far back in time. In this episode, we meet our third great-grandfather, another John, who was born just at the end of the 18th century and lived out his life through the 1800s. This was the Victorian era in England, the time when stern Queen Victoria was on the throne. It's an era that feels much more familiar and relatable than the medieval and early modern times we have visited to date. The Victorian era was one of rapid development and change, far swifter than in previous centuries. During this period, England changed from a rural agricultural country to an urban industrialized one. This involved massive dislocation and radically altered the nature of society. It took many years for both government and people to adjust to the new conditions. Our relative, John, and his family lived through this big adjustment. Strictly speaking, the Victorian era began in 1838 and ended with Queen Victoria's death in 1901, but the period can be stretched to include the years both before and after these dates, roughly from the start of the Napoleonic Wars in 1803, when our John was 12, until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Our John was born in Newton Sudbury, Suffolk, like his dad before him. In the year of his birth in 1791, the town would have been a busy place, experiencing the continued growth and activity associated with its established market and textile industries. John was brought up with his four siblings, Sarah, James, William, and Elizabeth. John was the second-born child and the first boy. When John was 12 years old, the first official nationwide census was undertaken in England. The early censuses, taken every 10 years, focused on population counts and numbers of people per household. But when our John was 50, in 1841, the first census to record individual names in England was conducted. From this point, we gain so much more information about the lives of our ancestors. We can find out their address, their occupation, their family members and their occupations, if anyone else was living with the family, as well as confirming each person's place of birth. When John was 24, he married Lydia Smith at St. Mary the Virgin Church at Gestingthorpe, Essex. Gestingthorpe will be a base for our Plampins for the next century. What took John away from Sudbury to this place? Unsurprisingly, we found that Lydia, his 20-year-old new bride, was born in Gestingthorpe and could trace her roots in the village as far back as 1749 and quite possibly beyond. The couple set up home in Gestingthorpe, with baby Mary Ann arriving 5 months later. This perhaps explains why the couple set up their home near Lydia's parents, rather than the usual pattern of remaining in the groom's village. At Mary Ann's registration of birth, we learn her father John was working as a labourer. This is a long way from our previous Plampins, who had held their own as landowners. We had spotted there were few records about our John's father. Only his Suffolk marriage and death certificates were found. Some research indicated that during his father's life, many gentry slipped out of land ownership due to sustained periods of bad harvests, logically coupled with rising food prices. This particularly impacted the smaller estates and saw many selling their farms to what were termed the new men, people who were making their fortunes in commerce, finance, and trade. From a gentry background, our John now found himself away from his connections in Sudbury, Suffolk, with a new wife and a young baby, and having to earn his living by labouring. 5 years later, another child, John, arrived, followed by Edward 3 years after that. But 5 years later, in the middle of the summer of 1929, tragedy struck, and Lydia died at 33 years old. This was the year England experienced a second cholera pandemic. It is now considered a defining epidemic for the time, with more people, over 52,000, succumbing to this disease than any other infection at the time. In the absence of records, we won't know for sure if Lydia succumbed to cholera. She was buried at St. Mary the Virgin on the 18th of June, 1929. What a sad time for the family. Daughter Mary Ann was 13, first son John 8, and the youngest child Edward just 5. Lydia's mother Hannah lived for another 17 years after her daughter's death. We can only hope she stepped in and provided some maternal care for the children. Because our John, Lydia's widow, remained unmarried for the next 10 years. This was unusual for the time, especially for men with young children. Perhaps it was an enduring love that made it hard for John to marry, or perhaps his lowly situation made him less attractive to marriageable women. Our John did marry again, 10 years later, at the age of 41. His bride was Sophia Niece, a 29-year-old Gestingthorpe girl. The couple had a winter wedding, marrying on the 16th of December 1832 in the same church as John's previous marriage, St. Mary the Virgin at Gestingthorpe. Notably, Sophia's father, Thomas, was a nonconformist, which meant he belonged to a Protestant denomination other than the established Church of England, which was Anglican. He could have been Baptist, Congregationalist, Methodist, Quaker, or Unitarian, among others. Nonconformists were known as dissenters and often faced social and legal restrictions due to their religious beliefs. Sophia, however, married John in the Church of England at St. Mary's. Despite the rapid industrial progress happening across England at the time of John and Sophia's marriage, like all villages in North Essex, Gestingthorpe retained farming as the mainstay of their community at this time. Its population at the time was 766, of whom 185 were farm workers. Some 50 others were employed in the 2 brickworks and iron foundry, while the remaining workers, such as cobblers, blacksmiths, thatchers, and wheelwrights, supplied the skills necessary to support the community. The village had 83 houses. Today, Gestingthorpe has 170. So one can picture it as a quiet, self-sustaining village out of the hubbub and progress of London and bigger cities. Even today, Gestingthorpe has retained the agricultural village look and size. It is sobering to realize that if our John's first wife Lydia had survived, you and I would not be here. After their marriage, John and his second wife Sophia set about building a family in Gestingthorpe while caring for the 3 children from the previous marriage. Baby James arrived in 1837, followed by Harriet, Joseph, and William. The last arrival was Henry, our second great-grandfather, who was born in January 1839. This meant the couple had 8 children to care for and feed. The 1841 census gives us a snapshot view into John and Lydia's home. We discover John, 48 years old, was working as an agricultural labourer, like many of the men in Gestingthorpe at this time. Sophia, 25 at the time, was caring for 7 children in the home, ranging in ages from 17 to 2. Eldest daughter Mary Ann was no longer at home. She'd married 4 years earlier to a local Gestingthorpe man and still lived in the village. The census records the family living at 20 Audley End, Gestingthorpe. Agricultural labouring at this time was very poorly paid, back-breaking, unmechanized work. Workers rented cramped and dilapidated cottages at the grace of their employer, the landowner. Workers faced the constant threat of poverty and hunger, particularly if they lost their jobs or experienced family hardship. In an aside, I did giggle at the photos of Victorian farm cottages. They looked exactly like the place Geordie and I stayed in when renting at Whiteway Estate, just a mile or so out of Chudley and Devon. The place was so damp, we used to extract gallons of water from our dehumidifier, despite the Aga being on almost all the year. Back to John and Lydia. Subsequent censuses, in regular 10-yearly increments, show the couple still at the same house in Audley End. In 1851, the couple still had 3 children at home: William, 17, Joseph, 15, both agricultural labourers now, and our Henry, 12 years old, with a job of horn sounder. I haven't been able to find any information on this job, so I'll go out on a limb and suggest he sounded a horn. 4 years after the census in 1851, the first formal school was built in the village. Before this, a dame school, kept by Miss Hale at Ashley Cottage, charged each child 6 shillings a week to attend. One wonders if John and Lydia could have afforded this for their children. Here is a photo of the teachers at the new public school. And here is a photo of the interior. I wonder if our second grandfather sat at any of these benches. Historians report that the schoolroom was perishingly cold in the winter months and was heated by a large tortoise stove in the centre of the wall near the door, conveniently placed right next to the teacher's desk. By the last decade of the 19th century, 100 children attended this school. The Education Act had been passed in 1880, which made it compulsory for children to attend school to at least their 10th birthday. The school building still stands today, repurposed as the village hall. The next census in 1861, 10 years later, finds John, 70, still working as an agricultural labourer, living with 48-year-old Sophia alone in the house. There are no children left at home. 4 years earlier, a diphtheria pandemic raged through England over a terrible 2 years. Scarlet fever also surged, with annual deaths doubling to 30,000 souls lost. Croup, thrush, and quinsy deaths were also greatly increased and were thought to be allied to diphtheria. Sadly, John and Sophia's daughter Harriet was lost in 1858, aged 23, and their son William, just 26, the year after. In 1871, the final census that captures John shows him still recorded as an agricultural labourer at the advanced age of 80 years old. Historians tell us that older farm workers did indeed keep working out of necessity and continued to perform physically demanding tasks like stone picking, clearing land, and weeding. They also worked in harvesting, animal care, and even skilled jobs like thatching or blacksmithing, depending on their abilities. Some elderly labourers might have taken on lighter roles like haymaking or fruit picking. Having done haymaking while on our farm in Devon, I can tell you there is nothing light about this task. It astonishes me that our John was still working at 80 and in such a physically demanding role. Four years later, John died at 84 years old. His burial is listed at Sudbury, not Gestingthorpe. This is a bit of a mystery until we follow what became of Sophia. Once John died, she would have lost tenure to 20 Audley End Road. In the 1881 census, Sophia is 81 and living at the Sudbury Union Workhouse, listed as a pauper. Workhouses were set up under the Poor Law Amendment Act to provide last resort basic shelter and food. They were notorious for very strict rules and harsh conditions. People who were not physically or mentally able to work were named the blameless. The rest were expected to work for their board, regardless of age. We can see from Sophia's record that she was occupied as a charwoman. She would have spent her days scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and maintaining the cleanliness of the living and working spaces in the workhouse. She would have had a plain wooden bed, a thin mattress, one pillow, a few blankets, and a chamber pot either for her use or to share with another inmate. We can see her fellow residents were engaged in a range of occupations from this record: farm labour, horsehair weaving, gardening, bricklaying, and hostling, moving a locomotive to a ready track in preparation for mechanical servicing. Sophia is by far the oldest resident on this record, yet still working for her keep. We can only imagine that 10 years before, John became too frail to do demanding farm work in the 4 years before his death, and had also ended up some time between 1871 and 1874 in the last stop for the poor, the workhouse. Sophia died in October of 1881. Her body would have been moved to the dead room to await collection from family members. At that time, only Joseph and our second great-grandfather Henry was alive of the children. Neither came to collect Sophia's body. County archives record that Sophia was buried in an unmarked grave in a designated area of the workhouse grounds, as was custom for unclaimed bodies. There was no money for deceased paupers to have a church funeral. A short service would have been performed at the gravesite on the workhouse grounds. John would have experienced the same end, buried in an unmarked grave in the Sudbury workhouse grounds. And so we come to the end of our third great-grandparents' story. I found it such a sad, moving story after their life of hard, back-breaking work. It is such a contrast to stories of earlier ancestors who had maintained homes and were buried with dignity. I wonder why John and Sophia's sons didn't arrange for a decent burial for their parents. In the next episode, we explore our second great-grandfather Henry's life. Perhaps that will provide an explanation.
It's a heartache, nothing but a heartache. It's you when it's too late. It's you when you die.